Hello, everybody. So in this video, I will be talking about the Missouri Compromise. These are the questions that you should be considering as you watch the video, and the questions that you should be able to answer by the end of the video. How does the expanding United States deal with the issue of slavery? How does political compromise lead to growing tensions between pro and anti-slavery states? And why did the Missouri crisis trigger threats of disunion and war? There are only a few key terms for this video, but by the end of the video, you should be able to define them. They are 1, the Missouri Compromise, 2, the Tallmadge Amendment, and 3, sectional nationalism. So I want to start us off by looking at a map of the Missouri Compromise, which happens in 1820. At this point in American history, there are free states and territories and slave states and territories. And the free states and territories include Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire. The slave states and territories include Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, the Florida Territory, and Louisiana, which was the latest state coming out of the Louisiana Territory, which was purchased in the Louisiana Purchase. So in 1805, Congress organized the land from the Louisiana Purchase into the Louisiana Territory. And in 1812, part of the Louisiana Territory became the state of Louisiana. Another part of the land acquisition from the Louisiana Purchase became known as the Missouri Territory, and by 1818, tens of thousands of settlers had flocked to Missouri, including slaveholders who brought with them some 10,000 slaves. The people of the Missouri Territory were allowed to send one person to represent them in Congress. And in 1817, the people chose John Scott, who was a respected lawyer. However, as more and more people moved to Missouri, they wanted greater control over decisions made about the area. They also wanted a stronger voice in Congress and the benefits of citizenship in the United States. So they began to petition for statehood, and in 1818, John Scott asked Congress to make Missouri a state. Now, when the status of the Missouri Territory was taken up in the House of Representatives in early 1819, its admission to the Union proved to be no easy matter, since it brought to the surface a violent debate over whether slavery would be allowed in the new state. Politicians had sought to avoid the issue of slavery ever since the 1787 Constitutional Convention, where they arrived at the uneasy compromise of the 3/5 Clause, which says that the entirety of a state's free population and 60% of its enslaved population would be counted for representation in the House of Representatives. Although slavery existed in several northern states at the time, the compromise angered many northern politicians because they argued that the extra population of slaves would give southern states more votes than they deserved in both the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. Now, this brings us to 1819 when Missouri is petitioning for statehood. The issue is, should Missouri be admitted as a slave state or as a free state? Admitting Missouri as a slave state threatened the balance between free states and slave states in the Senate by giving slave states a 2-vote advantage. The debate about slavery and representation shifted to a debate about the morality of slavery itself when New York Representative James Tallmadge, who was an opponent of slavery, attempted to amend the statehood bill in the House of Representatives. The proposal known as the Tallmadge Amendment stated that Missouri should be admitted as a free state, that no more slaves could be brought into Missouri once it achieved statehood, and it also proposed gradual emancipation of children born to slave parents who were already there, saying that enslaved children born after Missouri's admission should be freed at age 25. Northern representatives supported the Talmadge Amendment, denouncing slavery as immoral and opposed to the nation's founding principles of equality and liberty, while Southerners in Congress rejected the amendment as an attempt to gradually abolish slavery, not just in Missouri, but throughout the Union as a whole, by violating the property rights of slaveholders and their freedom to take their property wherever they wished. Slavery's apologists, who had long argued that slavery was a necessary evil, now began to perpetuate the idea that slavery was a positive good for the United States. They asserted that it generated wealth and left white men free to exercise their true talents instead of toiling in the soil. Supporters of slavery also argued that slaves were well cared for and were better off exposed to the teachings of Christianity. Above all, they argued that the United States had a destiny to create an empire of slavery throughout the Americas. These pro-slavery arguments were to be made repeatedly and forcefully as expansion to the West proceeded. Now, despite the big differences between Northern representatives and Southern representatives, the Talmadge Amendment manages to pass in the House of Representatives. In response, Southerners viewed the Talmadge Amendment as a huge threat to the sectional balance. They feared for the future of the slave system and saw the fast increase in Northern population and the Northern economy and believed that they were going to be left behind. Their economy, one that relied on the plantation system, was going to be left behind. At this point, representation in the Senate was still balanced between 11 free states to 11 slave states, but Missouri was the first state entirely west of the Mississippi made from the Louisiana Territory, so Southerners worried that the Talmadge Amendment might set a precedent for the rest of that region to be free states. They feared that if Congress could abolish slavery in Missouri, it might try to later in Southern states. Northern representatives, on the other hand, supported the amendment, denouncing slavery as immoral. Many abolitionists went so far as to protest the possibility of Missouri becoming a state at all if it were to be a slave state. This is really where we start to see national sectionalism come about. This is where there is loyalty or support to a particular region or section of the nation rather than the United States as a whole. So Northerners had their sectional nationalism and Southerners had their own sectional nationalism. In response to this growing crisis, former President Thomas Jefferson said, "This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror." What he was saying was that he feared that states were not fully complying with the United States Constitution, that sectional nationalism would win out over the federal government as a whole, and this could lead to the demise of the United States. Ultimately, the Senate refused to pass the amendment, and so Thomas Jefferson's fears were right. A national crisis loomed. To preserve the unity of a young nation that was divided along sectional lines and not party lines, Congress finally came to an agreement called the Missouri Compromise. In 1820, Missouri and Maine, which had previously been a part of Massachusetts, would enter the Union at the same time. Maine would be entered as a free state, and Missouri would be entered as a slave state. This would preserve the sectional balance of the United States, with there being 12 slave states and 12 free states. To prevent similar conflicts each time a territory applied for statehood, a line coinciding with the southern border of Missouri at latitude 3630 was drawn across the remainder of the Louisiana Territory. Slavery could exist south of this line, but was forbidden north of it, with the obvious exception of Missouri. The Missouri Compromise was largely accepted on both sides and lasted 34 years until the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act mandates popular sovereignty, which says that it should be up to the states to decide whether or not slavery should become legal. Now, even though the compromise was accepted on both sides, slavery becomes a dominant issue in American politics and a serious setback to national unity. So the major ideas that you should be leaving this video with are: congressional attempts at political compromise only temporarily stopped growing tensions between proponents and opponents of slavery. And the Missouri Crisis created a division over slavery that profoundly shaped sectional identities and rivalries.